The seventh slide. The seventh slide depicts Mort Klein and his landmark for 1919, so April 9th of this year, congressional testimony, and it depicts Mort at the House Judiciary Committee hearings that day, holding up an image of global ADL survey data showing a 2 to 3-fold excess prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism amongst Muslims, and I'll provide you with further explanation for that. So this alone was breaking a taboo, just showing the data. Much more profoundly was that Mort correctly linked this hatred to the Jew hatred inculcated by Sunni Islam's Vatican equivalent and its last two papal equivalents, Grand Imam Tantawi, who died in 2010, who happened to be the author of modern Sunni Islam's Quranic Conf on the Jews, and we'll talk about that in a bit, and the current Sheikh of Al-Azhar, Ahmed Al-Tayeb, who we'll talk about him further, but he actually rationalized why Quran 582 sets the parameters for relationships between Muslims and Jews in perpetuity. The eighth slide. The eighth slide is entitled ADL Global and Regional Studies of Anti-Semitism, and essentially it's showing you the 11 stereotypes that the ADL queries to those that it is surveying, and it asks them simply if they agree with these stereotypes, and they're quite traditional, have to do with Jews having too much control over governments, in this case the United States government, over the media, talking too much about the Holocaust, and interestingly, being responsible for most of the world's wars, which one could argue actually has a motif in the Quran itself. The 5th Surah, 64th verse, speaks of the Jews as sowers of corruption and discord. But at any rate, what the ADL does is determines agreement with at least 6 out of these 11 anti-Semitic stereotypes to define a case of what they call extreme anti-Semitism. So, in a sense, this is a very specific instrument, but it's not particularly sensitive. On the other hand, it is a very useful instrument applied worldwide now by the ADL to capture the prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism. This is now the 9th slide. So these ADL data highlight the striking excess prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism amongst Muslims versus non-Muslims, both globally and then in some of the regional surveys that the ADL has conducted since 2014. So basically 2014 through 2017. Overall, you see that there's an excess, 2 to 4-fold excess of Muslim Jew hatred relative to any other major religious affiliation or atheism, and this association with Islam persisted within the Muslim diaspora populations of Western Europe and the United States. Indeed, the world's 16 most anti-Semitic countries were all in the Muslim Middle East, where a rather striking 74% to 93% exhibited this extreme anti-Semitism. The prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism globally by religious affiliation was Muslims, 49%, Christians, 24%, those professing no religion, 21%, Hindus, 19%, Buddhists, 17%. And these were the data in tabular form that Mort Klein had held up during that congressional hearing back on April 9th. In Western Europe, the overall prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism within the Muslim communities was between 49% to 68% versus 12% to 29% amongst non-Muslims, with a 2 to 4.5-fold excess in individual countries observed. In the United States, the last country to be surveyed and where this questionnaire was administered, the prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism was 34% within the Muslim community versus 14% of the general population. Once again, a 2.4-fold excess. So actually quite consistent with the data that the ADL has compiled from around the world. This is slide 18. And now I want to get into Muhammad Sayyid Tantawi, who was not the current Grand Imam, but his immediate predecessor. Tantawi died in 2010. And I want to talk about his authoritative modern Quranic conf on the Jews, and also the fact that he was one of the leading Sunni Quranic commentators of the modern era. So he served as Al-Azhar University Grand Imam, again, Sunni Islam's papal equivalent, from 1996 to 2010. He was a leading modern Sunni Quranic commentator who edited a full 15-volume Quranic commentary. He also helped establish the largest online resource for Quranic interpretation called altafsir.com, which has published approximately 100 full-text, verse-by-verse searchable classical and modern commentaries on the Quran, including his own. And they span over 1,000 years from the 8th century to the current era to living Quranic commentators at this website. So it's a remarkable tool that he helped develop. Earlier, for his PhD, actually, he wrote a 700-page plus treatise, which translates as Jews in the Quran and Traditions. And I think having you read here this extract from Jews in the Quran and the Traditions, I think it's appropriate to call it a modern Quranic conf. This is a very typical summary extract from Tantawi's PhD thesis. Quote, "The Quran describes the Jews with their own particular degenerate characteristics, i.e. killing the prophets of Allah. That's Quran 261, 3:112. Corrupting his words by putting them in the wrong places. Consuming the people's wealth frivolously. That's Quran 4:161. Refusal to distance themselves from the evil they do. Quran 3:120, 579. And other ugly characteristics caused by their deep-rooted lascivious envy. Quran 2:109. Only minority of the Jews keep their word. All Jews are not the same. The good ones become Muslims. Quran 3:113. The bad ones do not. The Jews always remain maleficent deniers. They should desist from their negative denial. Some Jews went way overboard in their denying hostility. So gentle persuasion can do no good with them. So use force with them, and treat them in the way as you see effective in ridding them of their evil. One may go so far as to ban their religion, their persons, their wealth, and their villages," unquote. So these fuller Quranic litanies have been published, actually going back 50 years from Al-Azhar University. You can find a couple of interesting ones from 1968, but a more recent one was published in 2004 by Tantawi's Al-Azhar colleague and then head of the religious edict or fatwa committee, or former head of that, Sheikh Sakhr, and it was simply entitled in English, "The Jews' 20 Bad Traits as Described in the Quran." Slide 19. This slide emphasizes that one could argue that perhaps his PhD thesis, Tantawi's PhD thesis, was a less mature work, but that certainly cannot be said of his full 15-volume Quranic commentary. And that commentary includes a gloss on Quran 560, which is the Jews as apes and pigs verse. And it condemns in broad terms, quote, "the corrupt thinking and false assumptions and claims of the Jews," unquote, and further maintains generally, quote, "what you, the Jews, claim is even more evil, as shown in the penalty that has befallen you, as you have been cursed and become estranged from Allah's mercy and compassion, and what has befallen your ancestors, of whom some were transformed into apes, others into pigs." As during his tenure as Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Tantawi issued a hostile statement on interfaith dialogue just after he met with Israel's chief rabbi, Israel Meir Lau, in Cairo on December 15, 1997. And he included in these statements a reaffirmation of the views he expressed in his dissertation from the late 1960s. So by then it was about 30 years old. i.e. the Jews and the Quran and the traditions. And here's what he said. The Prophet's stance, which is my own stance as well, was that anyone who avoids meeting with the enemies in order to counter their dubious claims and stick fingers into their eyes is a coward. My stance stems from Allah's book, the Quran, more than one-third of which deals with the Jews. By the way, El Husani gave a statement to the Bosnian Muslim brigades in 1942 where he made the same claim, i.e., more than one-third of the Quran dealing with the Jews. Back to Tantawi. I wrote a dissertation dealing with them, the Jews, all their false claims and their punishment by Allah. I still believe in everything written in that dissertation, unquote. Apparently unmoved even after the gruesome Netanya homicide bombing, the Passover massacre of Jews on March 27th, 2002, Tantawi in April 2002 proclaimed the legitimacy of homicide bombing of Jews and condemned, again, the Jews as enemies of Allah, descendants of apes and pigs, again, per Quran 560, making his personal, religiously sanctioned Muslim Jew hatred eminently clear. Slide 20. Ahmed Al-Tayeb is Sunni Islam's current Jew-hating papal equivalent, and this is Al-Tayeb in his own words. In 2017, a publication that comes out every year since, I believe, 2009, produced by a so-called moderate Jordanian institute that remains much involved in interfaith dialogue, but came to notice prominently after Pope Benedict's Regensburg address, and they issued some statements about dialogue, and of course denouncing his speech at Regensburg, which was pretty clear about the jihad violence that had been wrought upon the Christian communities during the Middle Ages. So he was ranked number one in the Muslim 500 for 2017, and his Muslim 500 profile of that year stated, influence, highest scholarly authority for the majority of Sunni Muslims, runs the foremost and largest Sunni Islamic university, i.e. Al-Azhar, school of thought traditional Sunni. During an interview he gave in 2013 on Egyptian TV, October 25th, 2013, he explained the ongoing relevance of again, Quran 582, which has been invoked to inspire violent Muslim hatred of Jews essentially since the advent of Islam. And notice also the open equivalence of Jews/Zionists and Judaism-Zionism. And here's what he said. A verse in the Quran, 582, explains the Muslims' relations with the Jews. This is an historical perspective, which has not changed to this day. See how we suffer today from global Zionism and Judaism. Since the inception of Islam 1400 years ago, we have been suffering from Jews and Zionist interference in Muslim affairs. This is a cause of great distress for the Muslims. The Quran said it, and history has proved it. Quote, again, this is a quote from 582, you shall find the strongest among men in enmity to the believers, i.e. Muslims, to be the Jews, unquote. There was no reaction to this from global leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, with the exception of Dutch PVV leader Geert Wilders. He was the only one. And not only did he denounce these statements, he urged Pope Francis to denounce them as well. And of course, that did not happen, sadly. Twice, 2014, 2015, Al-Tayeb blamed, quote, global Zionism and its machinations for the proliferation of jihad terror in the Middle East. In January 2018, he claimed, bizarrely, that the Zionist entity was plotting to march on the Meccan Kaaba, the holy site around which you see these Hajj pilgrims circling. And also, the Zionist entity was supposedly going to attack the Mosque of Islam's Prophet. This is a statement he made in January 2018. During June of 2018, he further declared, quote, the issue of anti-Semitism is a lie that continues to deceive nations to this day. So there you have these statements from and writings from the last two Sunni Muslim papal equivalents.